Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and right now I'm just sitting down and filming a bunch of the reviews that have been stacking up on my backlist because I was lazy. So yeah, that's what we're doing right now. And so this is another review, obviously. I don't know why I'm rambling. Anyway, today I have another review for you, and that review is The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reed. So as most of my reviews, I want to preface this with saying that first of all, this is a spoiler-free review, so do not worry if you have not read the book yet. Second of all, I'm going to start with a little summary of the book and to tell you a little bit about what this is about. And then lastly, we'll get into my thoughts on this book. First my negative thoughts, then my positive thoughts, because I always like to end on a positive note. So let's start by talking about what this is about. This is an adult high fantasy standalone that is inspired by Hungarian, Eastern European and Jewish folklore. I mean, Hungarian is in Eastern Europe, but it's inspired by Eastern European folklore, specifically Hungarian folklore. So in this story we follow Vika, who lives in one of the last pagan villages in her country or empire or whatever. So you basically have three stand-ins for different religions within this world. You have the knockoff Christianity, you have the religion that very obviously is inspired by Jewish religion and more so I think Jewish history also within Eastern Europe, and then you have the pagans basically. And so the Christians of course are the main religion. I'm just gonna call them Christians, by the way, because I forgot what they call the god in this one. But so you have the Christians, who of course took everything from the other religions. And so you have Vika, who lives in one of the last pagan villages, and every few years one of the girls from the village, one of the women from the village, has to go with the king's woodsmen, who are his kind of elite soldiers. And they vanish, never to be seen again. Now something else that's special about Vika's village is that every woman in her village has a magical power, aside from Vika, that is. So when this year the woodsmen are coming once again to take one of the girls or women, Vika is betrayed by her fellow, not citizens, villagers, the fellow women of the village, and she has to go with the woodsman instead of the girl that was supposed to go. And that is then where the story starts. Now let's get on to my thoughts, and let's start with negatives. So I have one big negative about this book, which is the main thing, to be honest, that kept me from giving this a 5 stars, and that was the romance, because I absolutely was not a fan of the romance. The first thing was that it just, I don't know how to explain it, it kind of made me uncomfortable, because you had this element where Vika's love interest is a Christian, and because of that he's just, I mean, he's polite to her, but he basically sees her as less than human for a good chunk at the beginning of the book. And that just made me really uncomfortable from the very beginning. I couldn't get behind shipping them, and so when the relationship developed between them, I also just, I didn't feel it. Like, I didn't think it was problematic per se, but I didn't feel it. And then the second thing about the romance was that I just also didn't really believe it. Like, Vika around the 1/3 mark, maybe half of the book mark, starts to kind of feel some things for her love interest, and I just felt that came kind of a little bit out of nowhere, because yeah, even though he thought she was kind of less than human, he still treated her decently, but you know, that's just so he was a little bit nice to you and now you're gonna fall in love with him. So yeah, sadly I just couldn't get behind the romance, and also sadly the romance, I mean, it doesn't have a big part in the story, because I would say that the focus of the story definitely is on Vika and on her character development and on her finding her place in the world, and the romance just happens to be a part of that. So it's definitely not like a fantasy romance type deal where the romance plays a huge part in the story, but I also wouldn't say it plays a minor part in the story. So yeah, I just wasn't the biggest fan of that, sadly, and so yeah, that's the main thing that kept me from giving this 5 stars. But aside from that, let's move on to the positive things. But before we do that, I gotta change the battery on my camera. So I'm back. Now let's move on to the positive things. Let's just start with Vika as a character. I found her to be a very interesting character. She's definitely one of those characters who is very rough around the edges and who, you know, is not, I wouldn't say she's a likable character. I think she is one of those characters who we see more of a little bit, but who, especially if they're female characters, they are often just slammed and just, you know, ripped apart because they are just not soft. They have very rough edges, as I said. They are just who they are. They are broken, they are destroyed, and they have to find themselves before they can move on and before they can be palatable to other people. Like, she's not a palatable character. She is a character who is allowed to be angry, and I just very much appreciate that. I don't always like those characters or enjoy reading from those characters' perspectives the most. However, with Vika, I definitely highly enjoyed it, and I highly enjoyed her character arc throughout the story, because you just see that her rough edges come from having been abused and mistreated her whole life, not having had a place where she feels at home, where she feels she belongs, and kind of struggling with that. And the more she finds out who she is and where she belongs, or where she even wants to belong, the not softer she gets, because she's still a very harsh person. Like, I think we mistake soft with weak a lot of times, and she definitely never becomes a weak character, but she becomes a character who allows herself to be more open, and I just really enjoyed that about her character development. I think she is a fantastically written character, aside from the little fact that, you know, the romance. I'm not a fan of the romance, but aside from that, I definitely love that. Then the next thing I really enjoyed about this book was the Yehuli, which was the stand-in Jewish community. And I could really tell in the writing of this story that, you know, the author herself is Jewish, or at least has some Jewish roots, because they were so well written. Within fantasy, there is a long history of using negative Jewish stereotypes to, you know, not the most positive effect, I would say. You know, just using negative Jewish stereotypes, not in a direct connection with fantasy Jewish people or anything, but to give characteristics to negative races within fantasy. Like, there probably have been enough essays and works written on that specifically, so I won't go too in depth on that, but the last discussion that I can remember that was had about this on book Twitter, on the Booksternet sphere, was the negative Jewish stereotypes used within, I think it was Wicked Saints. And then also J. Christoph, I read it, Nevernight, that was it. So, you know, even in recent history, that is still something that happens. And I think a lot of authors nowadays aren't even necessarily aware where a lot of tropes and stereotypes come from, and that those tropes come from negative stereotypes about the Jewish community that have a centuries-long history within Europe, at least by now. So basically where I'm going with this is that within the Yehuli community, I just found it really refreshing to see kind of an examination of how Jewish people and how stereotypes about Jewish people have affected the Jewish communities within Europe, but also I'm pretty sure within America, and just examining that within a fantasy setting. And I found that so well done, and I found it so interesting, and I found it so beautifully done, because there was a celebration of this. And I mean, I gotta be honest, I don't know enough about Jewish folklore, I don't know enough about Judaism and so on. I cannot tell how much of this was actually taken from Jewish folklore, how much of it was, you know, embellished with other stuff, because this is fantasy at the end of the day. But I still found just the celebration of even the few aspects of Judaism or of Jewish community life that were put into this story, I just found that absolutely beautiful. And to me, in the end, it didn't really matter how much of that is real, how much of that exists in real life Jewish communities, because, you know, this is fantasy, and the Yehudi were a fantasy stand-in. And it's just, even if it's not 100% accurate, even if it was embellished with other things, I just think it's so nice seeing a recreation of Jewish communities within fantasy that isn't based on negative stereotypes. And so yeah, I just highly enjoyed that part, and that honestly is the main reason why I would recommend this book. And then the third and last positive thing that I want to say about this book is just the writing. Most of the time wasn't that standout to me. I would say it would fall into this category that I talk about a lot, where I don't really notice the writing. But every now and again there were sentences that just punched me in the gut. They were so beautiful, they were so powerful, and it was so good. But once again, I forgot to mark those sentences, so I can't even give you any examples. But yeah, that was it for my review of The Wolf and the Woodsman. If you're interested in picking this book up, tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. If you have read this, also share your thoughts on it in the comments down below. I'd be interested to talk about other people about this. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will also be left in the description down below, so go and check those out as well. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!